I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, thank you for tuning in to episode 154 of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. Our esteemed guest today shouldn't be someone that you need to get used to because you have actually heard from her before. If you've been riding with us for a long time, Rebecca Donatelli was episode 80 and is one of the most downloaded all time of our podcast library. So Rebecca, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. I'm so excited to be here again.
This is going to be such a fun conversation. Now, in episode 80, we chatted in depth, in great detail about social media tips, specifically Instagram, which we'll cover Instagram for those folks that love the gram, as they say. But Instagram is one of those things that I think can be its entire own discussion. And we want to focus this on what's most important in your life right this moment. You've just written your first book, Think Bigger. And I'm holding it for those of you that are listening in. Rebecca's smiling and we've got your first book. How cool is that?
Yes, I'm so excited about it. The fact that it's out and in people's hands is the craziest thing ever to me. So I'm really excited to talk about my book.
Good. And the majority of our conversation is going to be about your book. If you want, Instagram, these tips that Rebecca shared have been downloaded a ton of times. And I believe, and we all do in the real estate space, if you're one of our Calibrate crew that's been listening to us and loves the growth mindset that I do, and I know Rebecca does, you know that we talk to people who are actually making things happen, that are moving the needle, that are action-oriented. We work in a results-oriented business in real estate. And so I wouldn't put you on with someone here like Rebecca if she didn't have a tremendous following. She has hustled and grinded her way to over 15,000 Instagram followers. And we're going to talk about that briefly. But again, if you want to hear her strategy, she's already grown that 1,000 followers since our last interview, episode 80. Let's get into the book, Rebecca. So I had mentioned this to you as we were prepping for the show, but I didn't tell you what I would read from the book. And I've got Rebecca's permission to do this. So I'm going to read an excerpt from her book because I think it has a lot to do with the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. Obviously, it gives you a little bit of a freebie. Go buy her book and we'll talk about how you can get it. So I'm reading from page 73, and I'll say the chapter at the end. I'll never forget the time I had to have an uncomfortable conversation with a seller client. Their house had been listed with me for just over 3 months, overpriced with a dismal number of showings. I knew it hadn't been per lack of trying because week after week, I was calling agents, sending email blasts, and posting on social media about the listing. It really came down to price. We were just too high. I had talked up my 30-day average to sell a listing at the listing appointment. So I was fearful if I called them to have a discussion about why it wasn't selling, they would be disappointed in me. So what did I do? I didn't call them, didn't email them, didn't text them, crickets. I prayed someone would come through the door and present us with an offer, but no such luck. 30 days later, I got a call from the seller, which I screened until they left me a voicemail 46 seconds later. I took a swig of my Starbucks and listened to the voicemail. They asked me to call them at my earliest convenience, which I did 20 minutes later after chugging the remainder of my iced caramel macchiato. By the way, if you don't know, Rebecca is a Starbucks aficionado, and we'll talk about that in a minute too.
Yeah.
Continuing, the conversation went something like this. What's going with our home? We haven't heard from you in over 2 months and haven't gotten 4 showings since then, end quotes from the seller. Rebecca says, I gulped loud enough for my neighbors to hear and proceed to tell them our price was too high and we should consider a price reduction. Do you know how they responded? This is what the seller said. We wish you would have told us that 2 months earlier or 2 months ago. We just met with another agent and we'd like to be released from the listing agreement. And then you go on to say that not only did you lose the listing, they sold it at a price that you were going to recommend. And you know, you've been around real estate long enough. This has happened to a lot of us. That chapter, again, 74 and 75 in her book, Think Bigger, chapter 14, You Will Fall and You Will Get Back Up is the chapter name. So Rebecca, let's just talk about that for a second. These real estate top producers and people who are striving to make their careers better that listen to the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast, that hits home to all of us. And it just cuts me to the core because I've been there, done that. Bring us back to that spot that caused you to write about that story. And obviously that was something that I picked up immediately when I picked up your book. Just what were you feeling when that happened, and what can you do? What can Calibrate Calvin that's listening in? What can Calibrate Calvin do to, maybe present themselves a little bit better and educate their clients better?
Yeah, when I was deciding what stories to include in the book, I had to get rid of my pride a little bit and say, I have to dig deep and really be honest with people, because every one of us realtors has been in that situation. And those conversations, especially when you're first getting started, can be very uncomfortable. They can be uncomfortable even if you've been around for 20 years. Telling a seller that you maybe screwed up on the value of their home or commercial or whatever it is, it happens to us. We can't always determine that price. Whatever the conversation is, that communication has to stay open. That's the number one complaint that we hear a lot of times in real estate, is that agents do not communicate. They don't pick up their phone. They, especially if you're listing or something, they'll slap it in the MLS. Maybe they'll throw an open house and they'll call it a day. And we have to communicate. You have to be open with your clients. As uncomfortable as the conversations are, if I had just picked up the phone and had that conversation, I would have sold that house. And looking back, I'm just like, all right, girlfriend, like, you got it. Moving forward, just pick up the phone. This is your job. This is why they've hired you. So it was interesting bringing myself back to that situation when I wrote the story. And then I also wrote another story about another listing shortly thereafter that was kind of a similar but different situation. And you just have to be honest. You have to have that open communication with your clients all of the time.
It's such great advice. And isn't it interesting that as a thought leader, which as an author, one of the derivatives of the word author is the word authority. And so you've become an authority in the real estate space. You definitely have validated that with your 15,000 and growing Instagram followers. When you write a book, isn't that interesting that you've got to share some of the uncomfortable, really embarrassing stories to really captivate your audience? So what are some of the other kind of, maybe cringe-worthy moments that you've learned as you become a real estate agent? And then again, for our listener, Rebecca was a 30 under 30 for Realtor Magazine in 2019, which is how we got connected. We won't get a ton into that today, but she has obviously produced quite a bit. So it's not all these cringeworthy moments. She's definitely been on mountaintops. But what are some of these other storylines that you might have in your book if people are interested in picking up Think Bigger?
Yeah, and that's the other big part of where a majority of the book goes, is that you are going to fall down. You are going to have times where you're going to feel defeated or that you screwed up, whether it was purposely or accidentally. It happens to all of us. And the key is just getting back up. That's why a lot of people in our business don't make it, because they don't have the courage or the patience to get back up. So some of the stories that I told, that one, and then another listing story that I told shortly thereafter, they were hard. I told a story, probably the hardest story that I told in the entire book was the story about my team. When I walked into my team office and my two agents were sitting there with their bags packed, ready to go. I actually cried while I wrote that story. I cried a couple of times while I wrote a couple of stories. And those are hard things. And they're things that we all go through, whether, when you start a team or that happens with clients. I mean, any type of thing can happen. You have to have the courage to learn how to deal with it, understand why it happened, and pick yourself back up. And that's what I wanted to talk about with the majority of the book, is just getting back up, getting back into your groove, saying, it's okay that I went through this. It's going to happen to me again. And I'm okay with that. And I understand that. And I just need to pick myself back up and keep moving forward. That's what that leadership mindset is. And that is what the whole entirety of the book is about.
Rebecca, I am very appreciative that you share that story about your two teammates with their bags packed. There's a lot of people who are listening in that own a real estate brokerage firm like I do, or are a team leader, or are someone that has some folks working with them. They might be an entrepreneur that isn't even in the real estate space, but they just like this podcast. And we have all been through that. If you've worked with anybody on your team, they're not going to work with you forever. And it's not because you've always done a bad job. They might retire, they might, unfortunately, hopefully it's a long time from now, might pass away. But more often than not, they're usually leaving for a bigger, better deal, or a leader that is more capable. And gosh, what a gut punch. I mean, I've had that happen to me 7 or 8 times this year alone, post pandemic. I mean, just like you grow a company to 13 people and 7 leave, like, ouch.
It's hard. It's hard.
So what are some things you've learned from that specific experience? Because as I share with our podcast audience all the time, I'm probably the biggest learner. As a host, I get to ask the questions, and I want to learn, what have you learned from people leaving, and what are some things that you plan to do maybe next time around with your team so that you can maybe prevent that or at least be prepared for it?
Yeah. And just to back it as to why I wanted to share the story, as hard as it was to come out and just say, I walked into my office and 2 out of 3 of my agents dipped out. And it was really hard for me to share because at the time, and if you read the book, you'll hear about that I was going through something very personal at the exact same time. And so it was very lonely feeling and very hard to deal with. I will say that looking back, it was a mutual thing. It was not working out on my end either for a variety of reasons. And you do have to go through that when you have a team or you own a brokerage. People might think the grass is greener somewhere else, or they think they could do it better. They might leave to start their own team, which you'll hear about in my next book. But it happens for a variety of reasons. Maybe they feel like they're not getting the value that they thought, or maybe their expectations were way too high. Maybe they didn't have any expectations. There's so many reasons. And you have to look back and you have to say, what didn't work? What can I do better? It's not necessarily their fault. It might not necessarily be your fault. Some people just don't work well together. And I firmly believe, as a team leader, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, that everything happens for a reason. If somebody steps out of your life or comes into your life, there's usually a reason why. Those 7 or 8 people that happened to you this year, there's a reason for that. And it always ends up working out. From my experience, the whole thing ended up working out really well for me. So as somebody who's maybe thinking about starting a team or a brokerage, or you have a team, don't be discouraged by that, because that is the one story that every team leader and broker has never told. That happens to everybody. I just had to work up the courage to actually put it on paper for the world to hear. And I've had team leaders reach out to me that say, thank you for sharing that, because I've been through that and I never had the courage to share it. Everyone's been through it, whether you think that or not. And it's really important mainly to look back and say, what could I have done better? What can I change? What works? And maybe they just didn't work for me. Use all of it as a learning experience and grow from it and develop a thick skin, which is where that story comes from. Is talking about having a thick skin. You have to in this business for so many reasons. So that's where that story came from. And the one thing I want to really stress the most is that everyone's been through it. That they just don't write about it usually.
You've been around long enough, you'll go through some stuff, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Well,
yeah.
I think of, Rebecca's from Cleveland, Ohio. That's where she hails from. And when you follow her on Instagram, you will see Cleveland all over the place. Go Browns, right?
Yes, go Browns. Baker Mayfield bringing it home this year.
And in Denver, Colorado, we say go Broncos. And those Cleveland Browns have been on the losing side of a couple of real important games back in the day with the Broncos.
Yeah, those are not the only losing sides, unfortunately, but this is the year, man. So.
Well, in Denver, we listen to country music, and I'm not sure if they do that in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm sure they do, but I think of 2 country songs that I love. One's newer, called "Almost" by Thomas Rhett, where one of the main lines is "Thank God for the almost," and then I think of the older Rascal Flatts song, which is "God Bless the Broken Road," which is more of kind of a love song, but you just think of these like near misses, and I'm glad you called them learning experiences. My mentor, who's also a 30 under 30 back in 2005, one of the OGs, Matt, he really shared with me almost on a daily basis. He's like, hey, what'd you learn today? What were the learning experiences? And he celebrated failure. He celebrated missteps. Now, of course, he wanted to make sure that I was calibrating. He wanted to make sure that I made these iterative steps to making sure I was doing better. But that's part of the journey. There's a lot of trial and error. And especially when you're a leader, you're not going to be able to serve every single person. It's just not possible.
Yeah. And that's what I really wanted to get, is embracing I don't like the word failure. I like saying that you maybe fell versus failing. And that's really what it's about. And stepping into leadership and owning your stuff is understanding that it's okay to fall and accepting it, because it will happen to you. No matter how careful you might walk, it just happens to everybody. And I think embracing the fall and getting back up, and I've probably said this a million times through the book if you read it, that you should embrace that fall and you should be proud of the scars that you get when you get back up and keep moving forward.
You know, your comment reminds me of a few things. Back in episode 80, we had shared, and I know that you and I both have professional relationships with a guy named Wayne Salmons. And Wayne, in one of his keynote speeches, says he's a parent, and he's a parent of, I think, 5 kids. And he's like, I figured out how that happened and put an end to that. But after being, a parent to 5 kids, he's like, when one of my kiddos falls off their bike, he doesn't go and scream at them and says, "You're a faller, you're a failure." He goes, "You fell. Like it's a one-time thing. Get back up." And I think what happens is and as an accountability partner, I hope you appreciate this, Rebecca. I am in the process of writing a book. I actually spoke to a publisher yesterday, and it's not done yet. It's been drafted for about 5 years. So you've definitely one-upped me here with this. But one of the storylines that I am kind of talking about is this hashtag fail. It's a 4-letter word. It's the F word, hashtag fail. Like it just doesn't equate. It shouldn't be part of your vocabulary. So it leads me to, I think one of the more pivotal chapters in your book that I've got to share. It's at the very end, chapter 30. Make personal time a priority. Now, I know this probably comes from a lot of pain. And we talked a lot about the people who are leaders. And this book is a leadership book, but I would imagine there's going to be a lot of people in your audience that are aspiring leaders that maybe haven't gotten there yet. And a lot of people that are a part of our Calibrate crew are aspirational. They're not leading a team yet. And so what happens is a lot of us, especially 30 under 30s, but anybody that is going to move something, you devote yourself, you commit, you sell out. And what ends up happening is we're starting to work 50 and then 60-hour weeks and then 70 and then 80. And all of a sudden you're returning emails during dinner, and your significant other, your spouse, your kids are looking at you saying like, hello, so I want to share a few things that I picked up in that chapter, but let's just talk about personal time and just some things that you really resonate with on some appropriate boundaries, but just kind of making sure that you're making time for yourself, because I can tell that whenever someone puts that as the last chapter in the book, it's really an important thing for them.
It was. And out of all of the chapters that I wrote, that one was actually one of the hardest, believe it or not, because I had to look back at a very difficult time in my life where, and I admit in there that I had a really hard time with my now ex-husband putting work aside for my at-home relationship marriage. That was a huge problem that we had. And I finally had to say, for yourself, you need to make, this needs to be a priority. And I hate the word workaholic, but I love to work. I love to work. I don't feel like I'm working. It doesn't feel like work. Everything that I do, I love so much. So I just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And you finally get to a point where you might not realize how it's affecting you personally, how it might be affecting your relationships. And that personal time is crucial. So it was very hard for me to write, but at the same time, it's beneficial for every leader, whether you're stepping into a leadership role, whether you're already in leadership, to really relay that. And I put like a little fun list of things that I like to do if I need to take time outside of work, whether I leave or just hang out with friends or something like that. But you have to learn to put it aside. And it can be very hard for some of us that do step up into leadership. We always want to be serving other people. We always want to be answering our phone, whether it's a seller client that has a question at 11 o'clock at night, or one of your agents who at your brokerage or on your team who has questions for you writing a contract, or there's so many times where our phone rings or whatever happens. You always want to be doing things. And I went through a pretty hard period for a very long time. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm still working through this, but I felt a lot of guilt when I was not working. So if I wasn't working, whatever working was, If I was just doing something mindless, like watching TV, like normal people do at night, or, hanging out, I felt guilt. And I was like, this is not right. I need to actually live my life. I'm blessed to be in a field that I love so much that I want to do it all of the time. And not everyone is in that role. And I talk about that at the beginning of the book. But at the same time, you have to set that boundary. And as hard as it is, I now put it in my planner. I'm old school. I have an old school planner in my bag. I don't use my phone at all. Everything is in a calendar. It's literally set as an appointment, whether it's going for a long run, whether it's hanging out with my girlfriends, whether it's watching mindless TV or whatever. Writing is that for me too. So that is hugely important. And you're correct in that I did put it specifically at the end of the book.
I love all of that. And I know we're talking about Think Bigger by Rebecca Donatelli, but if you haven't read the book Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. Townsend, that is a fantastic book. Both are psychologists, and it's been millions of times over a bestseller. You've got to go get that book Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, I think is Dr. Townsend's first name. So Rebecca, you shared a few of the things that you do to let off a little bit of steam. And we're talking about let off a little bit of appropriate steam. I mean, there's some people who let off some steam and that's, they're kind of doing stuff that's damaging to relationships. But what we're talking about here is healthy, good activities. And so I'll run through a few of those things, but then I've got to share the title that I see on the top of page 186. So some of Rebecca's go-tos, write these down. If you happen to be on a run, dial this back, re-listen to it. Number 1, go for a long run. Number 2, get a coffee, Starbucks, of course, I'm sure, or support your local business.
Yeah, support local too.
Binge watch a favorite TV show or reality bad good movie, which I got to learn more about a bad good movie. Make a reservation at the best steakhouse in town, maybe after COVID. Hopefully we all get to do that. Get out of town, which I love. So this list, I love this. My quotes: put work down, chill the F, shut the front door out list. So
That's the list.
oh my gosh. So yeah. And she's obviously got the asterisk, not the real F word in there, but how did you come up with this list? Some of it's probably by necessity, but how'd you come up with some of these items, and what are some of your sort of, I got to do this every week in your chill the F out list? I've got to do this every month versus I got to do this every day. What are some of those kind of non-negotiables of like, this is my personal appointment time, as you talk about it in the book?
Yeah. So a non-negotiable is the running for me, is an always thing that I have to do. I love to run. We just got hit really hard yesterday with our first snow of the winter. It was blizzarding all day. So unfortunately outside is no longer an option. But for me, that is a non-negotiable, and any sort of physical activity, exercise, in my opinion, everyone should be involved in. And I'm not just saying that just to be healthy and whatever, but for your mental health. I've actually thought recently about getting back into fencing that I talked about in the book. I would love to get back into that. Unfortunately with COVID right now, it's not going to be an option for me, but running is a non-negotiable. I do it regularly. And then if I'm feeling extra stressed out or I need to put work down and just take a break, I will go and do that. I love a good steak and love a good coffee. So the coffee is usually also non-negotiable. I'm not even gonna lie, like that's usually a thing. And then just being around my friends and just talking to them, whether it's Zooming or something. For me, that's great, putting work down and just chatting with my friends. Getting out of town, obviously right now is harder than normal. So that list was written. I've been working on this book for almost 2 years. So that was written pre and also post, but anything basically to come up with that, whatever your list might look like, are things that you just genuinely enjoy. Work should not be on that list. Even if you love it as much as I do, as you do, it should not be a part of it. It should be things that are therapeutic for you, that make you feel good, that are an escape from work, whatever it is, whether you pick up a new hobby like knitting or writing. I mean, for me, writing has become so, I've always written. I had a random poem published in college one time. I just love to write. And so that also has now been added to that list. So coming up with your own list, whether they're non-negotiables that you make weekly, daily, monthly, or things that you make on your list when things get really hard or you're feeling extra stressed out. I encourage everyone to do that. It's hugely important. And one regret I have is not making that a priority sooner.
Oh, great sage advice. Before we go into the second half of our interview, we're actually a little bit over half of our time is done, and it's crazy. Feel like getting together, over Zoom here. We're just having such a good time together, and the podcast audience just gets to be a fly on the wall. It's awesome. I would be remiss if I didn't say this right now. We'll say it at the end of the show. Think Bigger by Rebecca Donatelli. So cool to hold this in my hands. Like, such a cool opportunity. And I can't wait, selfishly or self-oriented. Like, I can't wait to hold my own book in my hands, but that's got to be such a pinch me moment. If people want to get the book, we're going to be doing a really cool Instagram oriented giveaway. I have bought 3 of these, and I'm going to be very charitable this holiday season by giving away all 3. But if someone doesn't happen to win our sweepstakes, Rebecca, how do they buy your book?
Absolutely. So you can go right on Amazon. It's on Amazon as a paperback and an ebook if you want that. You just type in Think Bigger, Rebecca Donatelli. It's right on Amazon. And fun fact, because I'm glad you brought up Wayne, because I really didn't tell anyone I was writing a book except for maybe my parents knew, and then maybe 3 other people. And Wayne was one of those people. He's an author himself. And that moment when you get that book in the mail, I cried. And I think I videoed myself crying because I'm like, I actually got my book. It's the coolest feeling. Call me when you get your book in the mail when you're done with it. It's like an unparalleled feeling. So
Oh, I cannot wait. And I can tell just the like effervescent energy I see over Zoom. Like, I can tell that in the moment it was probably just like couldn't contain yourself, right?
it was crazy. It was coming through Amazon, and I literally had on my computer screen, you can track Amazon how many packages they have I literally was sitting there watching them deliver other packages, just waiting for them to come to my door. So yeah, it's pretty awesome.
It's like Christmas morning. Santa Claus is coming to town.
It is, and I just want more of it. So book 2 coming soon.
I love it. Well, and that's the really interesting thing. I think that I've heard multiple authors say this, and I'm sure that you'll probably feel this way too, that getting the first book done is the hardest, obviously. Book 2, book 3, book 4, like once you figure that out and sort of get over the hump on the first book, the others just start to happen. And I just interviewed Mike Michalowicz, author of Profit First, Fix This Next, Clockwork, et cetera. He's written 6 books. And I've heard him on different podcasts say that he is working on typically 2-3 books at a time, and he releases a book every 18 months or so. And it takes him about 5 years to write a book, but if he's working on a few concepts at the time, then he can launch them, and it allows him to marinate it. And obviously there's an editing process. So kudos to you. Obviously, go get Think Bigger. Second part of our episode here is I've just got to talk about leadership. I think that we'd be remiss again if we didn't talk about Think Bigger as a leadership book. It's obviously a book that's born out of success through failure, and that's all about Calibrate. Calibrate Nation knows about that, but leadership, especially in the real estate space, is real important. So I very intentionally wore my Colorado Association of Realtors pin today. And I know that there's a lot of realtor associations out there that are needing a lot of leadership. They're needing people to step up. That's something that you have been very vocal about. You talk about it in the book, but also on your Instagram, and then just, I'm sure, in person. Let's talk for those that aren't involved in leadership with the Realtor National Association of Realtors or their state association, or even just boots on the ground, their local association. What does that look like? Why did you become a leader? And then we'll kind of ask some follow-up questions.
Yeah. So, thinking about my whole leadership journey, I know that my business sales wise would not look like what it is today without a path into leadership and stepping up and being a volunteer leader at local, state, and national. I had no intention of getting on this path. I was never that like leader type of person. As you read, I was called in the principal's office in 7th grade for being a follower. I mean, that's literally, so that was never my personality. So it's kind of an unexpected but awesome journey, which is what inspired the book. I was tapped on the shoulder at the end of the first year of my business, and someone asked me, hey, we have this YPN happy hour. You want to come? And I was like, well, I don't know what YPN is, but I know what happy hour is. So I'll see you there. So I show up to the happy hour. I didn't really know what I was doing there because here I am having drinks with essentially my competitors. So I'm like, why am I hanging around people that are, competing for the same business that I could be at home making calls. But by the end of the night, they had shared with me some really awesome business tips. I was 25. I had just finished up my first year in the business. I had no idea what I was doing. I did have a successful first year. I was rookie of the year at my company. Sold quite a few houses for my first year, but I still didn't know what I was doing. And I still had a long way to go. And I realized, wow, I opened my ears and my mind and listened to these people. And these people who I thought were my competitors are actually sharing really awesome advice with me. So they asked me to sit on the YPN committee or come and just be a part of it. And they told me what it was about. And when I came to the committee, and I've shared this story before, but I didn't think that the committee at the time resembled what YPN was actually supposed to be. And so it kind of became my mission to change it to what it is. And YPN, became such a passion of mine. And so that's really what sparked my leadership journey. And so I am going to be president-elect of my local board next year, which I'm really excited about, which is fun. And now I sit on the NAR YPN advisory board. I represent Region 6 and a ton of other committees that we won't talk about today. But leadership, it also shares with you what I consider a lot of luxuries that we have as realtors. So for example, and these are things that I didn't realize. A great example is in the state of Ohio, they fought for our commission checks to not be taxed. So every time we would sell a house, we get a commission check. They were trying to tax each check on top of our tax season. But the volunteer leadership throughout the state of Ohio fought to make sure that I made more money. And I was like, that is so dang cool that we can actually have a voice in changing the law. Like these are things that we actively work on. And so seeing the behind the scenes things of how you can run your business and having a voice in the industry and protecting homeowners and their private property rights and protecting realtors is hugely important. And without the leadership, that doesn't exist. And there are so many luxuries that we have as realtors that you wouldn't have without that. And just also the networking and the business opportunities. This year alone, I've gotten 15 referrals from NAR friends around the country, people that I've connected with, whether they're YPNers or 30 under 30s or anybody. That's another huge opportunity. And just creating this family of people that I can't imagine my life without. The benefits are endless. And we are always looking for, whether it's local, state, or national, volunteer leaders who want to step up. They want to take their business to the next level. They want to learn more about the industry. They want to give back to the industry. And you will see the takeaways and everything for your business once you start getting involved in that. So highly, highly, highly recommend.
Oh my gosh. If you are a realtor, which the majority of our audience is, rewind that last 2 minutes. If you've ever been on the fence about joining YPN, about being in leadership. I mean, Rebecca, I can just tell you can go on and on because you just light up like a Christmas tree about that topic. Now, if someone is not a realtor, maybe they're a staff member, or maybe they're just a business owner that happens to download the Calibrate Real Estate podcast, and we appreciate that. I hear a lot of just masterminding and networking and appropriately giving back to an industry that's given to you, regardless of whether it's real estate. So for the business owners out there, I would just share that I think it's very important. And I've had several mastermind groups that I've been a part of, and they come and go at different phases of life. But I think it's just really important. As much as it may seem like you're hanging out with your rivals or hanging out with your competitors, you will learn more. And the best, most successful business owners have an abundant mindset. They are secure in themselves. They are not insecure. They know that by sharing some of their best practices, it's only going to make them better. It's only going to make the industry better. So that's a lot of what I hear in there as well.
Oh, absolutely. And people ask me all the time, they're like, why do you offer, because I own a speaking consulting business as well. And I work with other realtors, some locally and most of them not, but some locally on building their business. And they ask me, why do you offer help to other realtors? And here's the thing, we can all learn from each other. And I've exchanged referral business with local agents around here. Maybe they were too busy or I was too busy or it was in a part of town I don't work with or whatever it is. And the reality is that you're right. If you're walking into leadership or you're a business owner or whatever, you don't have those insecurities. You feel confident in sharing those things. And the way I see it, there's enough business to go around that you shouldn't feel threatened by sharing best practices with other people, because the reality is that nobody else is going to do it the Kyle way, the Rebecca way. We all have our unique way of doing things. There's not going to be another Instagram account that's identical to mine or yours or whatever it is. And so you have to be open because you never know what you're going to learn from other people. And that's where my business was able to kind of explode, just from learning from other people and offering up what I can to hopefully help them too.
Oh, yes, sister. Preach on. I love it. I love it. All right. Before we get to our last two questions that I ask every guest, and one of them I asked you in the past, but I imagine your answer has changed a little bit. Over my shoulder, if you're watching on YouTube, but if you're listening to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or shows kind of everywhere now, you're not seeing this, but I've got a couple of stacks of books because we've gotten this message out now through the Calibrate Real Estate podcast of over 150 episodes. We've had a bunch of authors on the show, and those books over my shoulder are books that we're giving away. So if you send an email to info@calibrate.re.com, that's for the old schoolers out there, or the people who are maybe a little bit shy about social media. Rebecca would rather you do some hashtags on Instagram. So if you hashtag Calibrate Real Estate, if you hashtag Calibrate Podcast, hashtag Think Bigger Book. And Rebecca, are there any other hashtags you're using for the book launch?
No, it's just been Think Bigger. But now that you mentioned that, I'm going to have to come up with some.
All right. Well, you could hashtag Rebecca Donatelli, and good luck spelling the name. We got two Italians here. But all kidding aside, if you do that here in the next couple of weeks, and depending on when you download this, the sweepstakes might be over, but if we've got extra books, we love to just give away free books. Please, again, info@calibrate.re.com. Kayla Davis monitors those. Our staff monitors those. Hashtag Calibrate Real Estate, hashtag Calibrate Podcast, hashtag Think Bigger Book, all of those different things. Okay. So last two questions, Rebecca, you ready? Rapid fire?
Yes.
Hey. So the first one, and is going to be, I hope, different now that you've written a book. I mean, putting your heart and soul into a book over a couple of years, you've obviously changed, and that's a good thing. Change is a good thing. You're still the same Rebecca, but different perspective, different life. Obviously, 1,000 more Instagram followers, et cetera. So this question, Dear Younger Me, comes from one of my favorite songs, and the writer of the song is actually writing a note to themselves in the idea that they would hope that they could pass this advice to themselves when they were younger. I've dubbed, even though this isn't in the song, I've dubbed this the advice you wish you knew when you were 22. 30 Under 30 is one of these awards that marks, and I said award, Rob Reuter would say it's not an award, it's a recognition. But 30 Under 30 by Realtor Magazine is a recognition that recognizes the youthful, and you have to be under 30, but there's lots of people that are over 30 that are doing awesome things and would love to impart some advice to younger people. What's the advice you wish you knew when you were 22?
Yeah. And I'm remembering, I don't remember what I said the last time, but the first thing that I think about is it's okay to not know where you're going yet, and it's okay to not be okay. And we've all been there where we think we know what we're doing. We go to college, or maybe we don't go to college, but we have an idea in our mind of what we want to be when we grow up. I say that, in quotes, whatever. I wanted to be a high school math teacher. Look how great that turned out. And so it's okay to not know exactly where you're going, and it's okay to do some self-discovery and figure that out. And it's okay to fall, and it's okay to get back up. Like I said earlier, I don't like saying, just like you said, I don't like fail. I consider it a fall. If something doesn't work out, pick yourself back up, turn around and appreciate the scars that you got from it, learn from them, understand why or how you got them, and use them as power to move up and move on. That's the best advice I would have loved to have had at that age, at a young age, because at that age, I had no idea what I was doing. I was an assistant store manager making probably $13 an hour, closing the store, which I loved. Um, but I was very, and I know these are supposed to be rapid fire quick, and here I am going off on a whole tangent. I just love to talk. I saw my friends getting, passing the bar exam and becoming lawyers and whatever it is that they were doing. And it was draining a little bit, not knowing where I was going and feeling insecure about myself, and allow yourself that discovery and know that somebody else's journey is not a reflection of your journey. Take your own time, do your thing. It's okay to figure it out, and it's okay to take time to figure it out.
Amazing advice. I think of C.S. Lewis, who's often quoted, and I'm sure there's other people who have said this, but C.S. Lewis ends up being attributed the most to comparison is the thief of joy. And we can all get into that when you're out on Instagram, right? You're looking at other people's stories or feeds or whatever, and you start to compare, right? So I loved that you said that. The other thing that I think about too, another thought leader, John C. Maxwell, who wrote the book Failing Forward, John C. Maxwell makes a real succinct point in saying that failure is an event. It is not a person. So you are not a failure. Failure is an event. It's something that happened, and you could diagnose it. You could do an autopsy on it. You can calibrate. You can get better. And what failing forward is all about is not that you may or may not fail. He says you are absolutely destined to fail at things. But the most successful people learn and actually profit from their failures. That's the biggest thing. And great advice. Now, a slight little twist, little iteration. Now that you're an author, if a 22-year-old comes up to you, once we're done with the pandemic, 22-year-old comes up to you and says, Rebecca, can you sign my book that I have, Think Bigger? And what advice would you give to me? I'm in my early 20s and I'm just getting my start. What's the advice that you'd have for that person instead of maybe yourself that might ask as they're holding your book saying, what should I do? I'm just kind of getting out of college, or I'm just getting my start and I haven't really, done a whole lot and I don't have a whole lot of experience. What's your advice to that person that's in your book launch line?
Yeah. So I also talked about this where I said that my ex-husband made a comment that I was so lucky to have found my passion. And he always used to say this to me all the time. And it used to drive me crazy. And now I thought about it and I was like, it is rare, and you might not know what your passion is. I had never thought twice about real estate until my mom suggested it to me. We were literally sitting at lunch and she was like, what about real estate? I was like, oh my God. And then here we are, So it's okay to not know, and it's okay to try things and see if they work for you. Don't feel like you have to figure it out in that moment, because I will be honest, you will not figure it out in that moment. And you should go through different things to try to help you. And you might fall during trying those other things. I was at an insurance company for 5 months and I fell hard. I hated that. And it made me realize what I didn't want to do. And going through college to be a high school math teacher, I still love math to this day. Calc 3 was my jam. I'm that ultimate math nerd, love it. And now I teach also. So it's kind of funny that it's kind of come full circle. But that was not my thing. And I had a breakdown in the middle of my senior year and said I couldn't do this. So yeah, I would tell that person it's okay to not know maybe where your passion is, and explore different things that feel good to you, maybe that don't feel good to you, and then learn from that. Talk to people that having that conversation with my mom, who's my best friend, opened my eyes to a world that I never would have thought twice about. And every time I think about that conversation, we were at lunch and I was not working. I was living in downtown Cleveland with my ex-husband, boyfriend at the time. I don't know what we were at the time, but we were living together. I think about, what if I hadn't gone lunch over that day? I never would have thought about real estate. It never would have crossed my mind. What would I be doing today? Would I have found something that I truly love? I would not have written this book. I would not be a 30 under 30. I would not be inspiring other people. And so I would tell that person, it's okay, chat with people. I talk about this also, interview like-minded leaders or people that have found something that they love and hear from them how they got there and how they explored it. But know that it's okay to not know quite yet. because most people at that age don't.
I love that you worked with me there on that slight little twist to the question. Okay, so final question, and
Yeah.
and I do need to say thank you, Rebecca's mom, for showing her the path, at least illuminating the path for her. And aren't moms great? All right, so
Yes.
the last question is something that's evolved. So one of my personal relationships, my career coach, this guy named Chris Oakley, was episode 5 of our podcast, and Chris tragically passed away about a year ago. His answer to that question and the way that I continue to live out his memory was actually that he was in this mentoring group in his 20s. The leader of the mentoring group had them read a book called The Principle of the Path by Andy Stanley. And in the book, Andy Stanley encourages his readers to write their own obituary. So this is kind of that Stephen Covey 7 habits of highly effective people, think of the end in mind type of question.
Yeah.
So I have twisted this just a little bit. If you were to have a loved one, Rebecca, deliver your eulogy, because that's a little bit more personal than like a newspaper person writing your obituary, right?
Yeah.
What would you hope that they would say about your legacy if they were delivering your eulogy?
The one thing that I would hope was in there out of anything aside from coffee lover, all the other things, is inspiring. For me, that is top tier. That is what all of this is about. I was inspired by so many people, whether they're in the real estate space or outside of the real estate space, my parents, my broker, so many 30 under 30s that I looked up to. I studied them, whoever it was. I would not be sitting here with you today had it not been for those people. And I realized how they got me to where I am. And I love giving that back to other people. And the one thing with this book, I wrote on a yellow Post-it note and I put it on my computer. I got this computer in the middle of writing my book. So I moved it from my big old school computer to I have a MacBook right now. And I just wrote the word inspire on the Post-it. And every time I would sit down to write my book, I would put it at the top of my laptop. And I actually still have the Post-it. That was the one goal of the book. The goal was not to make money. It was not to have sales or be an Amazon bestseller or whatever. Now, New York Times bestseller has made the goal list since then, but the one goal for this book was to inspire. And that is the one thing I would hope if someone were to write about me would be that I inspired at least one person.
Well, I know that you're obviously hoping to inspire more than one person, but I'll tell you, you've inspired me. You've inspired me by writing your book that I can and should do a similar feat. I should continue down that path, even though it's difficult and it's treacherous at times, but I should continue down that path. It's inspired thousands of people that are listening to this podcast. And Rebecca, I think that a huge kudos goes out to you for sharing some stories in that book that were difficult for you to write, that made you cry, that as you got the book, you cried with joy, you're crying with sadness as you're writing a story. I mean, it's just such an emotional journey being a business person, being a realtor. So you've inspired me, absolutely. And I know you've inspired others. If you want to get the book, you can join this sweepstakes. So those hashtags I had mentioned to you, Calibrate Real Estate, Calibrate Podcast, Think Bigger Book. Rebecca's book is out on Amazon, obviously. Google it, Think Bigger, Rebecca Donatelli. Go get her book. One of the things that I want you to understand as a podcast listener, when we have authors on the show, and we're having more and more authors, and that's something that I just feel so blessed to be able to do. When we have authors on the show, if you buy their books, they will be able to continue sharing ideas. And you're hearing this for free, but $10, 15, $20, go out and buy someone's book, especially right now, as you might be in some sort of stay-at-home order. You may be in some sort of, quarantining situation in our pandemic as 2020 closes out. We've got a lot of time on our hands. We're not traveling. We're not doing the same things we used to do. Go buy Rebecca's book. Okay. All right. Rebecca Donatelli, episode 154 of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast is in the books. But before we end, of course, download episode 80 with Rebecca, where she talks about all of her Instagram strategies. Rebecca, how do people find you on Instagram?
Yeah. So if you want to find me on Instagram, that's where I like to hang out. My handle on there is RebeccaDonatelli.realtor. You can message me on there. We can hang out together. come find me on Instagram.
And Rebecca Donatelli, author, obviously. Rebecca Donatelli, thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. As I love to say, we will see you around the neighborhood. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having me.